I'd like to invite you all to please keep your mics muted. And thank you for sharing all the countries and cities you're coming from. You can see Botswana, Germany, Belgium, Serbia, South Africa, Germany, Texas, Morocco, Egypt, Italy, Germany again, Jordan, Romania. It's great to have you all with us. All right. So again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series on building Nexus resilience, addressing migration and conflicts in water, energy, and food systems. My name is Bassel, and I'm a research scientist at Texas A&M Energy Institute. I'm also part of the leadership team of the NSF-funded SustainFood network, as well as a board member of the International Water Resources Association. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar series, which is a joint effort and a partnership between Texas A&M Energy Institute, UNU-FLORES, SustainFood Network, NEXUSNET, International Organization for Migration, PRIMA, which is Partnerships for Research and Innovation in the Mediterranean Area, International Water Resources Association. And it's a pleasure to also have our first webinar of this series, also part of the EU Green Week program. Before I start with introducing our motivation behind this webinar series and kickstarting the program, I'd also like to thank Rhouma, who is the co-chair of the Early Career and Young Professionals Task Force at IWRA, who will be supporting us with making sure our Zoom meeting runs smoothly, and keep an eye on different messages in the chat box. She will be communicating with us throughout the program with different instructions and resources. So why water, energy, and food and migration? As we look at some of the key trends, projections, and challenges facing us moving forward, we can see that by 2050, we are expected to need 55% more water, 50 to 60% more food, and 80% more energy. And these are grand challenges, but all are also very much interconnected. In fact, close to 70% of our fresh water is used by the agricultural sector. 15% of our global freshwater withdrawals go for energy production, and 30% of our world energy is consumed throughout the food supply chain from farm to market. And that's at a time where more than 2.2 billion people still lack access to safe drinking water, more than 700 million people still suffer from chronic hunger, and more than 700 million people still lack access to electricity. And while these are, again, grand challenges, tightly interconnected challenges, and while a lot of the research around in this space, looking at understanding, quantifying the interconnections between these interconnected resource systems and challenges, while this body of research focuses on that in light of key trends in terms of population growth, climate change, and urbanization, and looking at the impact of that on these interconnected resource systems, as well as different shocks, including extreme events and shocks like COVID-19. There's still a gap in the literature with one of the key trends that we see in terms of looking at migration and displacement and their impact on these interconnected resource systems, and vice versa. The role of scarcity within these resource systems and lack of security or insecurity of these resource systems, and its impact on people's decision to migrate or to move from one place to the other. And that's at the time where, according to the latest IOM report of 2024, close to 300 million, we have close to 300 million international migrants globally, and more than 100 million people who are living in displacement globally by the end of 2022. And that's for different reasons resulting from different conflicts we've seen over the past 2 years, including Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, Yemen, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Myanmar, which are the major ones, as well as there's been large-scale displacement triggered by climate and extreme weather-related disasters, including Pakistan, Philippines, Bangladesh, Brazil, and Colombia, among others. And we can see here on the figure on the right how a lot of these migration flows are either within same regions, but also that cut across different regions globally. So our motivation from this webinar series is to really look at these complex challenges at the intersection of water, energy, and food security and migration. And I think it's clear that there's no one discipline, no one sector, no one region will be able to address all of this complexity independently. Therefore, our key objective from this webinar is to catalyze a cross-disciplinary, cross-institutional, and international dialogue toward understanding what are the knowledge gaps, what are the opportunities in taking a holistic systems approach for addressing these interconnected challenges at the intersection of migration and water, energy, and food systems. This webinar is part of a series of a 3-webinar series to start with. Today we'll be introducing migration and water, energy, food system interconnections, followed by a second webinar, which we'll be sharing more details on later, which will focus more on integrating migration models and WEF assessments, how we could make those models better speak to each other. And the third will focus on governance considerations and using those models and tools to guide better evidence-based decision-making. In terms of the envisioned outcomes for this webinar series, we're looking at this as an opportunity to facilitate the development of a common framework and a roadmap for integrating migration into Nexus assessment tools, which currently is not, is a gap in the current literature, and also contribute to exploring the development of new anticipatory tools and strategies for incorporating those migration dynamics into Nexus assessments to guide better evidence-based policy making and to guide research agendas and practitioners' evidence-based interventions for more sustainable and resilient solutions. Now, before we start with our presentations and our panel for today, we'd like to have a sense of again, where you're coming from, which type of organization, as well as the distribution across different career stages with us in the room. So I'll just give us a minute to just quickly click through those, just so that we can get a sense of, again, our regional distribution with us in the room today, as well as career stage and types of organizations. All right. So we can see we have a good distribution across different regions. Maybe it's a bit late in East Asia and Pacific at this point, but we have a lot from Europe and Central Asia, some representation from the Latin America, Caribbean, Middle East, and North Africa, North America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. It's great to see that. Also see a very nice spread also across career stages, graduate students, early career professionals, mid-career, and senior professionals. In terms of types of organizations, we see that the majority are coming from academic research institutions, but we're also glad to have some representation from governments, non-governmental organizations, and nonprofits, and the private sector, as well as startups. So welcome again, everyone, and we have an exciting lineup of speakers, and like to hand it over to Dr. Floor Brouwer, who will be moderating the panel, after which we're looking forward to engaging with the dialogue with all of you. Thank you. Floor is yours, Floor.
Thank you very much, Bassel. It's my pleasure to join this webinar series coming from Europe, where we are currently awaiting for the elections for the European Parliament next week, where migration is certainly a highly and widely debated topic on across Europe. So me personally, I very much look forward to understand more on the link between the Nexus and migration. This afternoon, there were 3 highly qualified panelists, and let me briefly introduce them before they will present their contribution. The first panelist is Christina Daszkiewicz from the International Organization for Migration. Christina is a program officer on migration, environment, climate change, and risk reduction, part of the Climate Action Division of the IOM, and she has a graduation in natural resources law and international environmental law. And she will speak this afternoon about people on the move in a changing climate. How does it relate to the water, energy, and food systems? This will be the very first presentation, and she will be followed up by Dr. Nidhi Nagabhatla. She is from UNU-CRIS in Belgium, where she is coordinating a cluster on nature, climate, and health, and focusing on projects and collaboration on environmental governance efforts. She is involved in multiple international committees, including roles with UNEP, FAO, and IBIS, and showcasing that she contributes significantly to global environmental assessments and initiatives. And she will present the WEF Nexus for exploring migration dynamics and interconnected challenges. Dr. Bassel Daher briefly introduced himself, linked as a research scientist at the Texas A&M Energy Institute. And on top of that, I need to, and I wish to explain that he is widely involved in research activities from Texas A&M, but also heavily involved in multiple consulting activities with UN, FAO, UNDRR, IMI, GIZ, and other organizations. He is linked to coordination of the Water, Energy, Food Nexus initiatives, evaluation of programs from Penn State University, and leadership activities together with IWRA and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So we are privileged to have him to speak, and his presentation will be about systems approaches to migration and WEF resource management. So these are the 3 speakers for this afternoon. In preparing the presentations of the panelists, we thought a 10 minutes presentation for each will hopefully fit a pitch of the topic. And let me now give the floor to Christina Daszkiewicz to present the work. And I'm sure there will be more coming after the 10 minutes, but that could be either covered through the Q&A, and we plan to have some time available afterwards, Christina, to allow for questions. Welcome, Christina, to introduce your presentation.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Yes, okay, great. No, thank you so much for this invitation, and I have to say I'm very excited about the discussion that will follow the three panel presentations here as well. I think it's a very timely topic, especially with again the World Water Forum that happened last week and the purchase of the UNU-CRIS COP later this year. But so as introduced, my name is Christina Daszkiewicz, and I work for the International Organization for Migration, and I will be talking in the next 10 minutes more on people on the move, including in a changing climate and how it relates to the topic of the day, so water, energy, and food systems, and really more from like an introductory aspect, so really looking at, what do we actually mean by migration, what are the latest numbers, and some of them were already presented by Bassel, and then maybe raising more questions than actually answers in relation to water, energy, and food systems. But so to start with, I think one thing that's quite important to have in mind when we talk about migration is that there are different types of movement. It's really like it's not a homogeneous category at all, and I think this is quite visible, especially when we see the terminology around it. So whether it's in statistics and policy and legal frameworks, or in the media, just generally, there are a lot of different words flying around, and they have different meanings. So that's going to be the first part of the presentation. And the first word I wanted to touch upon was the one of human mobility. And the reason why I'm starting with this word, it's because it's an umbrella word, as an umbrella term, as we say on our side, and it's a very general term that encompasses displacement, migration, and planned relocation. So 3 terms that we'll also define shortly. It's a term that's used a lot in the context of our discussions on climate change, and so that definition specifically is taken from the Cancun adaptation framework. So then the next word is migration, and here, so I highlighted that the definition I'm presenting of migration is a definition that is specifically IOM's definition, and the reason for this is because there's no internationally agreed definition of migration. So as I mentioned, for example, for human mobility, you have an international framework that defines it. Migration is not defined per se in that way. So the definition that we use at IOM is really looking at migration, considering that it's the movement of a person or a group of persons that can either be within a state or crossing borders. And it can really be any kind of movement. It doesn't matter how long it is, and it doesn't matter the reason why people move, and like how many people, what type of people are in this movement. And that also makes, in a way, migration an umbrella term as well. But it's quite often distinguished from the next term that I'll present. So migration in many fields is actually understood as being primarily voluntary, as opposed to displacement, which is primarily forced movement. So for internally displaced persons, so really looking at people who are forced to move within the borders of a state, we actually do have a definition that is set by the guiding principles on internal displacement from 1998, and really it's taking the elements that I took before from what migration is. It's looking at people or groups of persons that are forced to flee. And similarly, the reason is not, we don't really distinguish. It can be because of conflict, it can be because of disasters and so on. But really what matters here is the fact that they do not cross a border. And the reason why it's so important, that context, is because then the legal obligations from a state to these people differs, whether they remain within a state or another. And statistically as well, it's not the same agencies often counting the people. And then the third word that was mentioned under the umbrella term of human mobility was the one of planned relocation. I think this one is a word maybe that we hear a bit less than the 2 first, but it's equally important, and it's quite different because it's actually a planned process, and quite often it's state-led or led by an authority. So it's a process in which persons or a group of persons are moved away from their homes, and they're settled in a new location. So really, it's a full process, like starting from the place of origin to the place of destination. There is a known plane of destination. So this is why it's planned, and they're providing with the conditions of rebuilding their lives. So it's also understood as a movement that's actually permanent quite often, and this is it's a form of movement that we can hear more and more about in the context of disasters and climate change, and especially sea level rise and coastal erosion, and for example in the Pacific Islands. And then I wanted to go maybe a bit more specific on two more terms. The next one is the one of the term of refugee, and this one is quite specific. So really, unlike some of the other terms I mentioned before, the term of refugee is actually, a legal status. So it has legal grounding. It's grounded in the 1951 Refugee Convention, and it's really based on, someone having a well-founded fear of persecution. So the element of persecution here is essential, and there are specific reasons for this fear of persecution that have to be met to be, able to get the refugee status. And of course, another element that's quite important is the fact that people cross borders. So that's opposed to internal displacement. Really, in both cases, it's forced movement. In one case, you might have persecution, and the other, you need persecution to actually have the status. But that's one of the main distinctions. Really, it's this border relation again, going back to the responsibility of the state in this context. And then the last term I wanted to touch upon here, going back to the definition of migration. So, and that maybe is also slightly more relevant to the discussion that we will have today, is the one of environmental migration. And similarly here, there's no agreed definition either. So this is the working definition put forward by IOM, and it's really referring to the people who, in the context of slow onset events or sudden onset events, are obliged or want to leave their homes. And similarly, similar to the definition of migration, it can be temporary, it can be permanent, it can be within a country, or it can be across borders. So this is also a bit more general than the two previous terms. But now that we've touched on the terms, we can look at the data, because the data itself also touches upon the different forms of movement. And one of the main facts and figures that were shared this year, Bassel presented them a bit. Next slide, please, Bassel. Sorry, next one again. So yeah, we have every year, the World Migration Report, and it just came out a few weeks ago, the one for 2024. And what we know now is, in 2024, we have an estimated, in the report of 2024, there has been an estimated number of around 281 million international migrants that has been determined, and that's around 3.6% of the population. And so we see a bit also the increase compared to the first report that we had around 24 years ago. And maybe something that's quite interesting, and that's on the next slide. It's both interesting and quite tragic. It's another report that's quite important for us is the Global Report on Internal Displacement. So I've already explained what internal displacement was. And it's so the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center every year provides numbers on, like what happened the year before in terms of like how many new displacement took place, but also how many people still live in a situation of displacement at the end of the year, and what we know for 2022. So that also these numbers came out 2 weeks ago. Is that there's been a trend for quite a few years now that numbers, of people, of movement of people in the context of disasters are actually higher than the ones in the context of conflict. And this is a trend that we have seen for quite a few years. And here we're really looking again at movement of people that are forced and that are within borders. So for this year specifically, we have 26.4 million new internal displacement in the context of disasters and 20.5 million in the context of conflict. With every year, the region that strikes the most in terms of internal displacement in the context of disasters is South Asia, and most of the movements that happen in the context of disaster are actually related to weather hazards that are water related. So this is to give you an idea about what we know now about the numbers, about the trends of movement of people, whether it's migration or displacement, but it's also we talk a lot about projections as well, and when we talk about migration, also in relation to water and food and so on. And one report that's quite prominent in this is the Groundswell report from the World Bank. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so this report really looks at a time frame up to 2050, looking at the movement of people within countries in the context of climate change. And when I say in the context of climate change, it's really looking at I think water scarcity, sea level rise, and food production, if I remember correctly. And it's so the number is that is quite often communicated there is that it would be around 216 million people that might become internal climate migrants by 2050 if no climate action and inclusive development is taken forward. So again, this is a pessimistic number, as they say. It's from their pessimistic scenario, meaning that if action is taken forward, actually people might not be forced to move. And the report really identifies hotspots specifically in relation to these numbers, and as you can see on the graph, so with a specific focus also on sub-Saharan Africa due to the numbers of people impacted in this context. One thing also we need to highlight, I presented a few sources for the different key facts and figures, and is that there is a lot of data out there. There is probably more data out there than data actually analyzed, which is I think quite interesting. And at least for migration, I think when I joined this field years ago, I was surprised by this, because it's something that we hear quite often from politicians or other people saying we need more data, but we actually do have a lot of data. It's just we're quite often sitting on data, and that's another question. But there is also in general around migration data a lot of challenges, and the first one is that there is no next slide, please. Sorry, Bassel. Is that there's no
Christina?
Okay, 2 minutes, got it. Is that there's no machinery to collect data on internal migration, for example, that the quality of data differs depending on the countries, because all countries don't have the same system. They don't have, there's no harmonized system between the countries. They don't use the same definitions either. There's lack of long-term data as well, and of course, irregular migration across borders is not recorded. So for my next minute and a half, I wanted to point out a few things in relation to the Nexus now that we have numbers in mind and terminology as well. So what we know about, so specifically the interlinkages between migration and environment, I wanted to start from this point, is that it's not a new phenomenon, right? People have been moving in the context, of water scarcity, for example, whether it's through seasonal migration to find alternative livelihoods, or because exactly due to water scarcity, their production is impacted, so they have to send, their elders on. Or we can also see, in the context of people that practice transhumance in West Africa, that also this has been a practice that is quite old. But what's new today is that firstly there's a new attention to the topic, but also in the context of climate change, there's a new scale of displacement. Maybe two things I would like to highlight for the end of this presentation is there is a new scale of displacement. This is not new, but so we know that there are interconnection between water, food, energy, and migration, and like, so that maybe three ways of saying it. So on the one hand, you have, you know, the pressure that migration can put on the resources. On the other hand, you have, you know, the impact of the changes in, you know, in water system, food system, and so on migration itself. And the third way of saying it is also, you know, seeing how migration can actually contribute to the solutions. So really this is understanding, you know, that yes, we can frame migration, of course, especially when it's forced, when you talk about internal displacement, you know, of course, it has a negative impact, and it increases the vulnerability of people. But there is also forms of migration that that increase the resilience of people. And for this, you need, you know, safe, orderly, regular migration. But migration can be a positive strategy for adaptation and livelihood diversification. And this is something that we have seen in different pieces of research, but also that we see in our work at IOM. And maybe two last points quickly. So the second point I wanted to highlight is really the element of multi-causality. So we can talk, for example, about the impact of, you know, water, food, energy nexus on migration. But really, it's not just that, right? It's also social, political, economic factors that come into play as well. So it's really important to have, you know, a full picture when we look at this interlinkages. And talking about food pictures, we talk a lot about movement of people, but you actually have a lot of people who end up being trapped and not being able to move anymore and become immobile within also this different interlinkages we were going to talk about today. And I'm happy to finish on this word. Thank you so much. And I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the presentation and discussion.
Thank you very much, Christina. This is wonderful. I think it's a kind of very quick crash course in the topic, and it's impressive. Thank you very much. There might be questions, I'm sure, and feel free to raise questions in the Q&A box, and they will be addressed later this afternoon. And if there is any topic not addressed this afternoon, the organizers will make sure to follow up on that in the coming days. The next speaker will be Nidhi Nagabhatla, and she will speak about the Nexus, migration dynamics, and interconnected challenges. Nidhi.
Thank you so much, Flor. Next slide, please. And thanks for the kind introduction. I'll give you an overview of how the WEF Nexus, Water, Energy, Food Nexus, and as we transition into understanding pathways to Nexus resilience, how interconnectedness with climate change impacts climate crisis, and in tandem, conflicts and migration are acting and operating to cause people exposed to these crises, but also making them more vulnerable. And how do we best understand this polycrisis to carve out integrated solutions? Next slide, please. And I think, yeah, this is something of an introduction words that I've already communicated. So we can already go to the next slide. And I'd like to explain this interconnectedness using a case study that I've been delving from for the past 5 years. That case study is on Congo Basin region, where we empirically assessed understanding the connectivity between water stress and migration. This region is very special in the sense that it allowed us to understand also the cross-border water governance dynamics and how it operates directly or indirectly towards the migration and conflict situations and scenarios. We also understood trade-offs and solutions that are put on the table by international agencies, by regional stakeholders, by national governments to address these crisis scenarios, not just the WEF crisis, but also the crisis of migration and conflicts that are acting in tandem in this region, and how this region is particularly connected to another big region known for a long-term conflict situation, the Sahel region. So this case study helped us to understand multiple level of dynamics and multifaceted challenges, direct and indirect, that triggers migration, either forced displacement or voluntary, involuntary mobility pathways. Next slide, please. So I think I'd like to at least go a little bit back and show this slide from from IOM in 2015 when we started carving out our research program on understanding the water, climate, and migration nexus. And this slide was largely one of the slides that were always in our research lab to understand how this is a defining year, and also the defining year because SDGs were launched and SDGs didn't even have a sustainable development goal focused on migration. The world was witnessing the Syrian migration linked directly or indirectly linked to resource crisis, resource conflict. And also at this slide also made us understand that it's time that we look into this issue in connection with other sectoral agendas in the WEF nexus, because disasters that have already crossed the number of people impacted then by conventional conflicts and violence episodes around the world. The more balloons that you see in blue, that were speaking to us. And when we started putting the data together, we could also make a statement that water, climate, and conflict and migration nexus are operating already at a significant pace in many countries and settings around the world. And by 2050, the world has to be ready to cope with 1 billion people on the move, directly across borders or within, as IDPs, as was explained, within the country and regions. Next slide, please. So the idea was that let's give some kind of assessment framework, a tool for member states, countries, agencies, and actors, even researchers, to understand how to present this complexity and and interconnected agendas to their government, to their policymakers. So just looking at the water security and human security nexus within the migration discourse, we charted out an assessment framework. Now it's a very simplified framework. It's not a blueprint. It was just for agencies and actors to get started. We divided the water scenarios using very simple water quality, water quantity, and water extreme scenarios. Then had sub-scenarios for each of these big scenarios and had indicators for each of those sub-scenarios to form an assessment tool. Migration, either forced or voluntary, was the center of this discourse, how water quality in terms of contaminated water, health concerns, health outcomes, directly or indirectly forces people to migrate. And we had case studies to provide empirical evidence, water quantity, too much water, and it's not necessarily disaster, but somewhere in between, too much water to handle. How that was influencing migration. And then, of course, something which was obviously connected was water extreme. And then delving into the case study. Next slide, please. So we applied this in the Lake Chad case study and the Congo Basin. I'm going to just show you one in the context of time. We again then went into generating hard evidence to show how water scarcity is forcing people to migrate and how people are migrating where water is moving or where seasonal water availability is there. And if you see the red dots in the diagram down in the Chad Basin, you see red dots. That is the movement of people we followed by juxtaposing number of images from several years. So spatial temporal analysis of following the water pattern, but also following how people are moving along the water presence. But you can see it's a transboundary basin, and movement of people is not as easy as it used to be under customary laws, where people had the freedom to move and practice livelihood activities. Now we have nation states, we have international borders, and people can't easily move through their customary rights, especially the pastoral communities of Africa that had some kind of negotiated customary rights to move with their cattle. And in the next slide, I'll show you more about this point, which has been a cause of concern, but also a cause of conflict in the region. And you see these pastoral communities are not just a kind of specific groups, but also is a kind of these pastoral nomadic societies is a practice that has allowed people and their livestock to move into as a seasonal nomads and to share water resources with the host communities. After the nation state and the nation state had international borders, these communities in particular find it very hard to be able to move across borders. They are sometimes classified as migrants or sometimes refugees, but these are the rights that have not been integrated and not been discussed as we discuss migration solutions. And one key point about this case study is that these people have also started to move along the water availability pathways. So from water scarcity pathways, where the water crisis, the water competitiveness, or because of climate change, the water availability is less, to newer pathways. And in those newer pathways, their customary rights are not they're not respected, in the sense these customary rights are not negotiated in these newer pathways, and as a result, they're not welcomed in those newer zones. And over time, we have seen an increase of violent conflicts in the Sahel region. Some researchers also link it to the Boko Haram movement, where young people find a bit more. They link as a result of the conflict. They have found some kind of refuge in those operations. Next slide, please. And if you really want to delve deep, I will be able to share some of these publications in the chat later on. But this is just to show that for every point, we have to go deep, dig out data, dig out information, but also talk to stakeholders, non-state stakeholders, that's communities, but also state stakeholders. And sometimes because of the disconnect between the ground level stakeholders and the national level and regional level authorities making migration decisions, we can see that there are several episodes of conflict, disagreement. There are solutions that are put on the table but not agreed, and they have been a kind of a stalemate situation. And my next slide will explain one such solution that has been put on the table to manage migration resulting from water scarcity or water crisis in the Sahel region. The Trans-Aqua project, which connects the Congo Basin to the Sahel region, a 2,400-kilometer long canal, to be funded by international agencies, especially the state of Italy, as tabling the agenda for Mediterranean security. And next slide, please. If you see the chronology of this project, it started in 1982 and still is in the process of discussion. It's been 40 years that the parties have not agreed. So, but even if we have solutions, even we have financial commitment, unless stakeholders agree to a solution of managing water crisis as a result of managing livelihoods and income generation opportunities for people, making these solutions inclusive, making a more participatory approach to the solution building to manage migration or especially forced displacement due to water crisis, non-availability of water for livelihood generation. These solutions, they still remain in the proposal stage and are never fructified. Next slide, please. So I think some of the observations are that we know that it is very challenging to clearly tease out direct drivers of migration or how climate crisis, water crisis, food crisis is directly or indirectly linked to forced displacement or mobility pathways. We can make a case, not necessarily quantitative, sometimes qualitative, using qualitative indicators like stories, narratives, perceptions. And that is one of the reasons that migration related to climate crisis, water crisis, has not made way or has not been a part of the priority agenda for stakeholders in African region, but also in the European region. Yes, we understand that the migration pathways are mostly linked to economic migration or political migration, but not much is discussed in terms of climate migration. We do see in the past 10 years, we have had some evidence in taking this agenda forward, but it's high time that we integrate water security, food security, and energy security as key agendas to manage migration. I think this was more or less what we have discussed for the past 10 years in the migration program that I'm coordinating UNU, first at UNU Canada and then at UNU Belgium. And we have been discussing this at several forums, including with agencies like IOM, but also water-related agencies, high-level political forums. Next slide, please. At COPs in the past years, we also made a case that this is not just a problem of the global south, where resources and vulnerability, where resource scarcity is deep and resource vulnerabilities are too visible, but also for global north that's increasingly facing climate crisis in terms of flooding, and how flooding and climate disasters, climate crisis call for more in-depth look into migration pathways. And the closing slide, please. So this is just for the discussion, and also in terms of the health outcomes. So we thought that health is one of the significant agendas that brings the migration discourse back into the priority agendas of different regions and also in the global governance. And health also has been a very underlooked aspect in the migration discourse within the WEF Nexus. We talk about water insecurity, water crisis, but that has significant health outcomes, food security, same, and also energy security. So I think we are repositioning the migration discourse through our academic research, through our knowledge analysis, to bring also health in this nexus. I'm just leaving you with another elephant in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nidhi, for the insights of important work on the Nexus with a focus on Africa. Well appreciated. I think we are well in time. And let me remind you, there is one question that I think we should definitely try to discuss in the Q&A. That is about migration projections. How informed are people in governments? And what are commitments from government and NGOs? So we will come to that after the next presentations. And meanwhile, feel free to add any questions you may wish to discuss in the following Q&A. But having said that, we now come to Bassel to speak about systems approaches to migration and WEF resource management. Thank you, Bassel.
Thank you very much, Floor, for the introduction and for moderating this panel. So I'd like to focus my 10 minutes with this presentation on focusing on making a case for the need for taking a systems approach to migration and water, energy, food, resource management. I'll build on the motivation that I started with at the beginning of the session with looking at the interconnected resource challenges by also looking and illustrating those interlinkages through different cases from the literature. I'll be specifically focusing also on migration trends in Texas and in the US, as well as highlighting as a case study we worked on with the UNDRR on looking at the interconnections between energy, food, and human mobility in Northern Central American countries. And we'll wrap up with a few open questions to continue the discussion with. First, I'd like to share that research at the intersection of water, energy, food, and migration is an area that we've been working on actively for the past few years at the Texas A&M Energy Institute. And we've been publishing different case studies, exploring these interconnections and looking at different case studies. And here I'd like to acknowledge also my colleagues, Silva Hamiya and Kostas Papas, who've been close partners in this line of research that we've been working on. And I'd be happy to share some of that research throughout my presentation now. So going back to looking at links between migration, water, and food systems, and I'd like to illustrate that through different cases we find in the literature. So as we look at water scarcity and how it could be a driver for migration, an example of that was through in Syria, through looking at the prolonged drought between 2006 and 2011, which contributed to agricultural collapse, which affected livelihoods and resulted in or contributed to mass migration from rural to urban areas, exacerbating social tensions and further contributing to the Syrian conflict. On the other side, we see trends like in India, where we see rapid migration to urban areas, which is resulting in increased water demand in these urban centers and leading to more severe water stresses in cities like Chennai and Bangalore, where we have further stresses on infrastructure in those urbanized centers, which struggles to keep up with this growing population. On the food side, we find examples from Central America, which we'll be elaborating on a bit later in my presentation, on food insecurity that is contributed to by climate change, droughts, and monoculture farming and crop failures in countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which has often resulted in driving people to migrate from these countries, often to the United States in search of better living conditions. On the other side, we also see displacement and shocks, like in the case of Bangladesh, where due to the war in Myanmar, the arrival of Rohingya refugees, which ended up straining local food resources and contributing to food insecurity in host communities and increased demand for humanitarian aid in Bangladesh. On the energy side, we see examples from sub-Saharan Africa, where as a result of the lack of energy and the reliable electricity services in rural areas, this serves as a push factor for people to migrate to urban centers where energy infrastructure is more available and more developed, which ends up resulting in rapid urbanization and putting strains on urban resources. And the last example is maybe a more positive twist to it, as Christina mentioned earlier in her presentation, where also migration could be a catalyst for further development and further growth, where we see in one of these studies in China, where it's projected that more than 300 million people will migrate from rural to urban areas, which is resulting in expansion of large-scale cities and rapid growth of future energy services, which also again is a different lens to look at migration. Now, zooming into the US and Texas and looking at some of these trends, these are maps that show inward and outward trends from different counties across the US, and I chose a few extreme examples maybe here to demonstrate the volume, first of all, and the potential impact of such trends and understanding such trends. We can see here two counties in Texas, Harris County and Travis County, and all the inward population, net inward population into these counties from all across the US at the time, where in states like California and Michigan, we see a lot of outward flows of migrants, net migration flows, which begs the question of the need for better understanding these trends, better quantifying these trends, better understanding the predictors for these trends, so we could better anticipate what these flows would mean, what are key push factors and pull factors that are impacting and driving these trends, but also quantifying the impact of these trends, positive and negative, that they have on these localized regions or states where we have potential positive impacts, where we have contribution and growth to local economies, but also how we could, through better understanding those trends, combine that with our future resource planning for these states, and to ensure that we are accounting for that among other trends. This is a more recent view of the net migration trends from 2021 to 2022. And we can see that Florida and Texas are the top 2 states with net migration inflows, where more than 1,200 people on average settle in Florida every day, and close to 1,000 people settle in move to Texas every single day on average. And we can see the highest outward migration flows are in California and New York, with close to 600 people leaving the state on average per day. So again, it begs the question of better understanding the motivation behind these flows, the push and pull factors, and to incorporate those trends and projections into better resource management for these states that are facing these extreme trends. For the rest of my presentation, for the coming couple of minutes, I would like to also highlight another white paper and project we worked on with UNDRR, which looked at the potential for taking a systems approach or adopting a systems approach for disaster risk reduction, and through exploring the nexus between energy, food, and human mobility in northern countries of Central America. And I think I'd like to echo, as part of the study, a message shared by Christina earlier, highlighting the need for understanding the different political, social, economic context within these hotspots and areas that we are looking at. So our primary goal from this study was to do a systemic review of the literature, as well as through consultations with stakeholders from northern Central American countries, specifically Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, to identify evidence of interconnections between energy, food, and human mobility, but also linking that to different hazards and how could that inform better disaster risk reduction strategies. And we started looking in the literature and doing consultations to look at evidence of these connections, and we found that indeed there are many connections and trends across energy, food, and human mobility. And I'm not going to go through all the details of this figure, because that could be a presentation on its own. But what I'd like to emphasize here is that while we understand these links between energy, food, and human mobility, there are also many other factors, vulnerabilities, underlying conditions that also play a role in exacerbating those pressures on these systems and on better predicting future human mobility, but also looking at it from a mitigation or intervention perspective allows us to really explore multiple root causes and underlying conditions that need to be addressed that could contribute to addressing these challenges. So things like weak institutions, lack of transparency, economic instability, land tenure system, gender inequality, poverty, etc., as well as other vulnerabilities in terms of dependence on imported energy, supply disruptions, poor land management, monocultures, among others. So we see a clear gap overall in the literature as we look at this migration literature, where we see study of key predictors on migration, but a lack of a holistic system of systems understanding and view of how all of these systems are interconnected, how all of these predictors and factors also potentially interconnected, so we could have a better understanding of maybe different entry points to address these trends as we move forward. So moving forward and going back to the focus of our webinar series, which is building Nexus resilience and looking at addressing these questions at the interconnection of migration and WEF challenges, we need system-level understanding of these interconnected challenges, which would allow us to explore and leverage currently untapped potential and opportunities, and would allow us also to mitigate unintended consequences where they occur. We need to develop novel tools to better understand and quantify those interconnections and decisions made across these sectors, and to better evaluate what are these trade-offs and synergies associated with different pathways forward. We also need enabling environments that allow for developing new research, new interdisciplinary research that cuts across different research disciplines, with looking at disciplines that are connected with all of these resource systems, but also looking at the social, environmental, economic, governance perspectives and aspects of these questions that we're hoping through this webinar series, and as we continue this discussion, that we're providing that room and space for us to have that dialogue across different research disciplines. Also, no one sector and no one country or no one stakeholder group will be able to address all of this complexity on their own. So there's a need for enabling environments for building partnerships across different types of stakeholders, different stakeholder groups across public, private, civil society, academia, across sectors and across disciplines. So to wrap up with a few questions and potential research opportunities which could be explored moving forward, is how we could develop new decision tools, methodologies that would allow for a more holistic risk assessment to better facilitate our understanding of trade-offs and synergies between migration dynamics and ongoing dialogues and push toward water, integrated water management, energy transition, food system transformation, and the interconnection between all of these interventions across these systems. How could we better understand how shortages or access issues in water, energy, and food resources can drive migration decisions in different regions? Also, we need to better understand what are the socioeconomic consequences of WEF resource-driven migration on both migrants and host communities, as well as understanding and investigating novel structures, governance structures, and policy frameworks that would allow for integrating these approaches of understanding and addressing migration and WEF resource management related questions and policies moving forward.
Thank you very much, Bassel, for these insights about migration in the US and the link to water, energy, food. There are a couple of questions, and I would like to focus on two of them. The first question relates to migration projections and how informed are people and governments, and what are commitments from government and NGOs. And that is specific about the migration projections. And here I had in mind to give all three speakers a brief response, if you wish. And similarly, I think it would be nice to hear a brief remark from each of the three panelists related to the specific questions on water, energy, food. And there was one comment that examples about food and water in relation to migration might be evident, and that might give a comment from you. But there was a question of whether the examples of energy scarcity could be found from the literature. I propose to give Christina to answer whatever you wish. And here you may also share some thoughts of the work on policy and socioeconomic conditions. Then Nidhi to share your opinion and reflection on the empirical work, and Bassel, and that hopefully we could do in the coming 15 minutes. So a few minutes, hopefully for you, Christina, and then Nidhi, if you agree.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the question. I think I'll take part of the first question that also relate to projections and the awareness of people and the policies and actions being put forward. So I guess overall, maybe the answer is just not enough. So there is awareness, there are policies, but it's still not sufficient enough compared to the scale of what is happening and how people are impacted and how they will be impacted based on the projections. But we have seen progress. So we have seen progress also, in terms of, how much attention the topic is getting compared to maybe 10 years ago, for example, whether it's in the media, whether it's in policy forum, whether at international level or national level. And I think maybe something that speaks to this really is if you follow, the discussions in the context of the COPs on climate change that happen every year. So last year there was a decision, on funding to respond to loss and damage, and actually, one of the beneficiaries identified under this funding now are people moving in the context of climate and affected as the people basically we discuss about today. And it's the first climate funding that actually has migrants, like climate migrants, under its scope. So I think it speaks though to a raised awareness now, and a change maybe in the situation. Then we have also seen, progress as well at regional level. So, for example, 2 years ago, in the Eastern Horn of Africa, there was the Kampala Declaration on Migration, Environment, and Climate Change that has been adopted, where you have a series of commitments specifically to address, to avert, minimize, and address what is happening. We also have seen last year in 2023 Pacific framework on climate mobility, but also one in Eastern Caribbean. So governments are like there is a raising awareness around what is happening, and there is also a raising raising political commitments around it. And I guess the question is, how is this being implemented? And that's another question where, to be honest, we don't have that much data once we have the political commitments, but you have more and more at global level. So I talked about things related to the climate change forum, but also climate change field, but you have when we look at the migration field, we have in 2018 the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Migration that has been adopted, which also has specific objectives related to this. So, an objective, I think it's the objective 2 and the objective 5, one which looks at addressing the drivers of movement, which includes, of course, environmental degradation, climate change, and disasters. And you have objective 5 that looks at enhancing safe migration pathways for people. So in this context as well. And we also have, disaster risk reduction, the Sendai framework at international level. So we have tools at international level, and at regional level, there is progress, as I have mentioned, and at national level, it really varies from country to country. But if this is something you're interested in terms of political commitment and legal frameworks, there's actually a database that tries to put them all together, like all the ones that actually address this nexus. I'm happy to share it with you. I think something that's quite interesting, maybe this database is, of course, a living tool, so it needs to be further worked on as the policies and legal frameworks evolve, and also the political commitment. But for example, something maybe we're missing is, and I think the work of Nidhi was also excellent on what she was presenting, and also the integration of migration in water governance processes and water policies and so on, which is something really important. And similarly for the energy policies as well. But all this to say that while we don't know, exactly at least at a global level, the level of implementation sometimes of this commitments. I mean, we do know that there are ways forward, right? So we the way we frame it at IOM, and that's how we frame our work more general on this topic, being also a very operational organization, is that we frame it as finding solutions for people to move, finding solutions for people on the move and finding solutions for people to stay when it's preferred by the people and the communities. And really this relate again to what we were discussing earlier in the presentations. It can be examples of migration as, labor migration, like circular migration when you have context of water scarcity and decreased livelihood. It can be, and doing that in a safely manner. It can be supporting states and having, human rights-based approaches to planned relocation. It can be, as Bassel highlighted, also measures of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation to allow people to stay in place when that's what's preferred. That's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for these additional insights. Nidhi, you want to follow up? And you might have seen there are multiple questions about migration and Africa. But
Sure.
linking them up to water, energy, food, and whether there is evidence, whether some resources might be unexplored yet. But we look forward to your opinion and evidence from your work.
Sure. First, I'll reiterate what Christina just said. It is, I think we are today in 2024, we are much ahead of when we started in 2015, gathering evidence, data, knowledge. At least at the UNU level, we started organizing research programs, activities, proposals to understand this nexus. And I think data and information remains very crucial in making or influencing decision-making process, right from local to national to regional to global. And I think IOM, of course, has been a leading agency, but through several working groups like the FAO working group on water scarcity for monitoring migration and displacement. We have been working on how food security, food insecurity, water insecurity, and the related crisis is influencing migration pathways through a case study approach. So I think the interagency collaboration has also played a significant role in empowering member states and related agencies to look migration from beyond the conventional push and pull factors, which was primarily economical and political in some sort of origin. So I think the interagency work and different agencies' contributions to generating knowledge and influencing member states to reckon and acknowledge how migration pathways and human mobility pathways are advancing beyond the regular understanding, I think is commendable, and it has also made inroads to high-level political forums. But also climate discussions. At least in the past 3 years, we have noted multiple sessions focusing on climate crisis and migration. Though I must say that I must point out that adaptation has not recognized migration as the adaptation discussions have not recognized migration as a regular strategy for people to cope with climate change impacts. So I think we are not yet there, but we are on track to position migration as something that links directly or indirectly with climate crisis, but also with the WEF nexus. Having said that, we don't reckon an approach like a blueprint approach, because the socio-political conditions, the socio-cultural climate, and the socio-economic scenarios in different regions are very distinct. And talking about our experience from Africa, we have noted that though, for example, the point in the question raised by one of our participants, yes, we do have, Congo is a very water-rich region, but it's not just about physical water availability, it's also economic water scarcity. We may have, the region may have a big Congo River, but for people, that water is not getting into the system to be transferred to people and those in need of water for daily needs, for irrigation and for other uses. So there is an infrastructural problem. There is a lack of financial commitment to take water from the source to the need and the users. So I think that's where also one of the big significant problem for the state. And then the state is also, or the region is also committed to having some role in mitigating the water scarcity and water crisis of the Chad region or the Sahel region. So I think that interconnectedness and that complexity, political complexity, the geopolitical relations between regions, and how water and crisis and its influence on people's lives, whether they are forced to migrate or whether they are displaced because of water crisis. They have to look for newer avenues to find water for their own needs, but also the need of their cattle, their flock, which may have 50,000 cattle at one point of time. That's their economic currency. So these are very specific and nuanced issues that need wherein context-specific solutions needs to be figured out, and to make the solutions, there need to be intra-regional dialogue. That would mean a dialogue between different regions within Africa, but also how Africa actors and agencies linked to this nexus, WEF nexus, but also the cascading impacts in terms of conflicts, migration, climate crisis, is interacting with international partners or international agencies like the European Union, US, through their other economic and financial agreements and arrangements, and how what kind of financial pledges, what kind of programs are committed to address this, to generate evidence for policymakers to take action. Through this project in the Congo region, we figured out that there was no proper data. If data is there, it's lying in the books of the ministries. It's not easily accessible. So to construct evidence itself is a very challenging task. And we only encourage research donor agencies to fund more programs so that data and information can be made available as a resource to leverage negotiations, to support discussions and dialogue. So I think I'll pause here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nidhi. You want to follow up on this, Bassel, and maybe we could then continue with the next part of the program.
Sure. Thank you all for your questions. I've been addressing some of the questions in the Q&A through writing, but I see a couple which maybe I could spend a minute on, so we can stay on time, and we could address the rest later. We could follow up on those. But a couple of questions, maybe one from Kushal, which asks about the already complex nature and data challenges we face in the WEF Nexus assessments and knowledge and tools and methods, and how do we integrate migration within existing WEF systems. I think that's exactly the discussion we're trying to have here. There's a lot of and we'll probably elaborate on in the next session, in the next webinar, where we have a lot of migration models and tools and different types of migration models and tools with different projection capability and different ability to understand the contributing factors and push and pull factors to help us understand these trends. And the idea we're trying to do here is to bring those, and as you know, we have a lot of WEF Nexus tools and models and approaches as well to quantify the impact of different interventions on WEF systems. So the idea is, this is still an open question, obviously, to how could we marry between those models and be able to have them speak to each other so we could have better evidence-based decision making. And maybe a 10-second answer to Martha. I also think she has a very interesting question. I see Christina responding to her also. I would say the response to having updating the legal language would probably start with creating better evidence that could drive such discussions. So we are creating new policies, new legal terms that are based on evidence that guides those definitions and those broader system level definitions. Thanks for the rest for their questions. I see Mike and Cuthbert had several. We'll be having a communication brief in a few days after the session, and we'll make sure to address your questions in those briefs moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Bassel, and thanks to Christina and Nidhi for your follow-up on the questions. And I'm sure we will continue on this in the coming days to get a response into the communication brief. And now we come to what is said in the program Dialogue Reflections. And here we are very happy to have Professor Ali Rhouma from the PRIMA Foundation, who is a project officer in the PRIMA Foundation responsible for Nexus water, energy, food ecosystems research. And PRIMA is in the heart of the Nexus community in the Mediterranean region, and we are happy to have you confirming your availability to share your reflections on this program, Ali. Feel free to share your thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for discussing this very important topic, migration. Let me just start by what we discussed recently in Bali, that we integrated also the migration as an important component in the ministerial declaration. So I believe that all of us, not only in the Mediterranean but all over the world, we need to tackle this important, migration could be also have seen as positive, but also we need to discuss, and we need to integrate a lot of information. And as I said, now in the ministerial declaration, it has been clearly stated in the recently. So let me start by maybe participants are eager to see some potential solution. I would like to highlight some important solutions that could understand and also limit the migration. But just to remind you before going to this, it looks like migration is a bad thing, but migration should not longer be viewed as a problem, but as an adaptation strategy as well as a policy for economic development. So it can sometimes be a way for people to adapt to this change, especially if it is well planned and coordinated. I can see the example of USA and European Union that have benefited from the planned migration, and migration could translate into economic growth through increased income tax revenues and skilled labor to the receiving area, especially as I said, if it is well planned migration. So having said that, I have some solutions, potential solutions that could help to whether understand or maybe limit the migration. First, I would like to start by this very important strategy. All of us, we know very well, we have the national adaptation plans. We have discussed a lot during different COPs, and recently COP 28, we have the adaptation plan, national adaptation plan. And we have a lot of funds for these NAPs, for the NAPs. So now there's a necessity to implement these national adaptation plans. We believe that the regions are already staggered with the resource scarcity, the inefficient resource management, are more vulnerable to migration pressures. So the fact to implement the national adaptation plan that can reduce migration by enhancing the resilience to climate change and resource scarcity, which are key driver of migration. So the NAPs could improve the water management, enhance the agricultural productivity, and also ensure reliable energy access, thus stabilizing the local livelihood. So you see here that the fact to implement just the national adaptation plan, so we can limit and we can reduce migration. My second point, potential solution, the WEF Nexus, water, energy, food ecosystem. Maybe a lot of people, for them, the WEF Nexus is only the biophysical resources. No, we have the socioeconomic component. It's an important component on the WEF Nexus. But the fact to integrate the biophysical resources and the socioeconomic components, this could help to understand and also to reduce the migration. Several models, with my respect to the They are only focused on the biophysical resources, and they overlook the socioeconomic dimension. So I think this is very important. The Nexus planning could help to understand the connection and guide decisions towards sustainable solutions. I think we need to see how we can integrate. We have a lot of migration models, but in the same time we have a lot of models, in particular the systemic or systematic or system dynamic model. Their models, they are separate, and then the fact to integrate the different models could help to understand, and also, as I said, to do this connection and guide decisions towards sustainable solutions. So in the WEF NXT, we have the component, the human component is there, the stakeholder engagement. So I believe the human component is in the heart of the migration, and the fact to integrate all these economic components, as I said, in different models could help, of course, to reduce and to solve migrations. My third point is the rural communities, which are the most vulnerable to climate change. And sometimes the migration start from these regions. So to enhance the agricultural development in rural communities could reduce migration by adoption of climate smart farming practices. You know, in particular, I know very well in the Mediterranean, the monoculture, as has been mentioned by Bassel, I think this is one of the main factors that people would like to migrate or displace to have more incomes. So the fact to adopt and maybe to help the rural community to adopt this climate smart farming practices, improve the access to water and migration, and support local farmers, because you know the food security is coming from the small scale farming system, and the fact to support the local farmer with educations, resources. So these practices could increase the food security, boost the local economies, and create sustainable livelihood. And this will make less necessary for communities to migrate or to displace. My fourth point, and I will stop here because we are run out of time, and I think it has been clearly highlighted. We have a lot of scattered database, different database for the migration. So why we can think to have a shared database? Because a shared database could help to solve migration issues by providing comprehensive, real-time information that helps in the coordination and implementation of policies addressing migrations. Just you can see the database. Several scattered database, but we don't have so far a shared or common database. So I believe I will stop here for the sake of time, and we have a lot of challenges, and thank you so much for inviting me and PRIMA to be part of this very interesting webinar. Back to you, Flor.
Thank you very much, Ali, and I think you raise multiple challenges that should commit us to advance in this webinar series. There will be 2 to come, and but before coming to a close, I want to thank the 3 panelists for the wonderful contributions you made, and I think we will share the presentations in the foreseen communication brief to be shared among the participants in the coming week or so. And there might be some open-ended questions in the Q&A that we try to follow up as well. And hopefully this webinar series will offer sufficient ground for a kind of knowledge agenda on the topic, and having expressed words of appreciation to the speakers and the reflections from PRIMA Foundation, which is extremely helpful. I also want to thank all participants, but definitely I also want to thank Rhouma Assi, who will be given the floor for us to share a survey, and that will be the end of the of the webinar. Rhouma, I'm sure you will.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Flora, and thank you for the panelists and for this very interesting webinar. It's clear how much this is yet an unexplored topic. However, it is very important to be looking at it, especially how the WEF Nexus could act as an enabler to look at these different systems approaches and how to actually implement or respond to the migration. I hope this would also bring more attention, and hopefully in the following webinars we could be tackling different topics. Now, for now, I'll be sharing with you the QR code. Please scan this QR code so that you can share with us your feedback, and here it's also in the chat box. Share with us your feedback. We'll give you just a few minutes. And also, please, if you have any topics in mind that you would be like to be in the next webinars, share this as well in the feedback form. And we hope to see you in our next webinar. I'll give the floor back to you, Bassel.
Thank you, Rhouma. Nothing more to add from my side, but we look forward to your feedback on the QR link, and we'll be following with a message with more details on the communication brief that is to come, and the website that I would invite you to also look at, where we will be keeping track of these webinars. Thank you again for your attention and for your time, and wish you a great evening and a great rest of the day.
Thank you.